Hey, what's up, tribe? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the TFC Audio Project Down Under. This week I chat with Nick Rees, who is a sports physiotherapist based in Melbourne. Throughout the episode, we chat through Nick's background and journey with physiotherapy and sports, the importance of an empowering narrative and mindset in injury rehab. We dig into running mechanics and performance and how footwear can affect this, as well as the concept of load management and the foundations for maximising recovery.
This week's episode is brought to you by TFC Courses. After touring our feet balance and play workshop across Australia over the past 12 months, we wanted to turn it into a digital resource so that anyone who couldn't make it along to our in-person events could learn and play from home. If you've already completed the Foot Collective's Workshop 1.0, there is still plenty of value in our updated version, with more than 3 hours of content covering crucial theory on feet and footwear, balance, play, breath, and ground living, plus simple ways to assess your function and restore your feet and lower bodies from the ground up. This course is designed for people of all ages and movement abilities, and we've even included some bonus training videos where James takes you through some guided routines to work on your feet, ankles, knees, and hips. The course is just $42, and if you use the discount code 10OFF at checkout, you can save 10%. To check it out and use that code, head to the link in our show notes.
All right, so Nick, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, mate.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. I've been looking forward to this chat. It's been a bit of a long time coming, and we originally connected through Instagram, I guess, and you were sort of connected with some of the foot nerds down there as well. I think, is that right?
Yeah, I used to work with Tom Davey.
That's right. Yeah.
Andy Bryant, and most of my TFC connections would be through Instagram, but I guess the Melbourne barefoot community is pretty strong. So
yeah, it really is. Melbourne always seems to be like the hotspot for if we come down and do workshops or seminars or anything. They usually sell out the most in Melbourne, and everyone seems to be maybe not a lot more, but everyone seems to be pretty excited about it down there. And I always love visiting. So hopefully it won't be too long before I can visit again.
Yeah, hopefully. Let's hope lockdowns and border closures don't last too much longer.
Yeah, and it'd be good to connect in person as well, because obviously, this is the first time we've really chatted face to face, I think, actually.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Which is cool. Yeah, I do like Instagram, how it has its issues, I suppose, but being able to connect with a lot of like-minded people all throughout the space and other people that you wouldn't usually connect with, I think is a really powerful thing that Instagram sort of provides to society. So you're obviously a very like-minded physio, and just have a lot of similar beliefs around movement and feet and all of that. So I'm excited to dig into it all. But usually I just like to start the podcast with just getting a bit of background about yourself and what you do, why you do it, and we just roll from there.
Sounds good. So yeah, I've been a physio for 12 years now. I got into physio through playing sport. I was lucky enough to play sport as a teenager at a level where we used to travel with physios, and I was kind of like, oh, this is great. This is work. It's helping people. It's sport, travel. And so that's why I guess I got into the profession. Now I work as a sports physio. I work in private practice at a clinic in Melbourne called Melbourne CBD Physio. And then I also work in sport. So I work for Hockey Victoria.
Right.
I'm the head physio for the Victorian men's hockey team,
right,
which is called Hockey Club Melbourne. And I guess clinically, hockey's a running sport. I see a lot of runners, and that has led me to go down the foot health path. What's the best I can do for the runners that I treat, for the athletes I work with. And then I think outside of that, like unknowingly, I was just a barefoot kid. I was a total beach rat when I was a kid. And so I was always barefoot. I would like challenge myself to get through a whole day barefoot, like it was hot in summer, that kind of thing.
That's a challenge in Australia.
Yeah, even like when I was a kid, I remember my mum letting the whole family know. She was like, hey, I've had the carpets cleaned. Everyone, can you take your shoes off when you get to the house? And then she was like, Nick, can you put some shoes on because your feet are always so dirty, kind of thing. So like I just kind of was always barefoot, and nothing to do with foot health or anything like that. It was just how I like to be. And so that's kind of I think what helped lend me towards being more barefoot orientated as a therapist. And then I think from that, it brings in other movement attributes with, I guess, general movement variability and movement health and that sort of thing. So yeah, I guess I dabble in a few different things, but ultimately for me, it's mainly about sport.
Yeah. And you play hockey yourself, hey? Do you? Or you play? Yeah.
Yeah. So I still play. I'm definitely like in the has-been category
Okay.
of hockey. Don't play as seriously as I used to. But it's great working. Like it was hockey that I used to travel with, and it's great working with guys that are sort of coming through where I used to be, and then even at a much higher level than I've ever played. So yeah, I think I've seen both sides of the coin from that sport, which is great.
Yeah. And so with physio, you are primarily seeing sports people or only sports people?
Primarily, definitely still see, I don't know, general population is the kind of term that gets used, but yeah, definitely see anyone that wants to come through the door. But a lot of what I do is working with recreational through to elite athletes.
Yeah. And what do you find, out of interest, that is the biggest differences like between seeing athletes and general population? Like, do you find, I know when I was working as a physio and seeing clients, then generally I think athletes will stick it's probably that's probably talking too generally, but athletes at least they have a specific goal in mind, like they want to get back to their sport or something like that, whereas I've found people in the sort of quote unquote general population, you sort of really had to work with them to figure out what kind of functional goal they're working towards, other than just, I want to be out of pain. Yeah, what have you found with that, with sports people?
Yeah, I think it's funny. There are some really good athletes that aren't as motivated to do rehab as maybe someone from the general public. But I think the goals are different. Maybe one way to answer it might be, what's the difference between, say, general physio and sports physio? Because you always should be goal focused. But I think performance in the athletes is the main thing. So to some extent, it's about winning the game or winning the race or running a PB or whatever it is. Whereas maybe for the general public, it's more being comfortable doing the things that you want to do. So with the athletes, it might be, okay, like the grand final's in 2 weeks. I've just hurt myself. What can I do to get ready for that grand final in 2 weeks? Whereas yesterday I saw a runner who's, he's struggled with pain for 6-8 months, and he's happy to go really slow because he just wants to get there in the end. He doesn't mind if it takes 2 weeks or 6 months, as long as we get there in a really good way. So it's the goals are just a bit different. For him, it's I just want to ultimately be able to run how I want to run, whereas for the guy who's got the grand final in 2 weeks, it's, I want to win the premiership in this timely manner. So it's just different in that regard, and that's what I think. That's one of the reasons I love it, because I've been an athlete where you had that real focus like that, and I really enjoy that timely nature of it. The kind of pressure of, we've got to get this athlete right as soon as possible. I love that kind of pressure.
I know for myself as a physio, the more injuries that I'd had and recovered from and had experience with personally, then I found the more I was able to help other people. Have you had your fair share of injuries, and has that sort of shaped your physio practice much, or what's been your experience with that?
Yeah, definitely. Someone asked me on an Instagram Q&A a couple of months ago, like, what injuries have I had? And I started rattling them off, and I was like, oh geez, I've had a lot of injuries. I think my first sort of major injury that affected anything was when I was 15. We were playing at the national championships, and I hurt my back, and I missed a couple of games of that championship, and I ended up playing the final, but I was sort of patched through to get through to that. And that was probably at that age where I started to want to be a physio. But I've had ankle injuries. I've had ankle sprains on both sides. I had foot surgery. I've had like hamstring strain, groin injuries, a few back injuries. Yeah, I've definitely had my fair share. And then definitely being in that rehab, I've not done my rehab well at times. I've been a really good
Yeah, same.
rehabber at times. I think every physio probably has to admit to that one. But like, I think that shapes me because I understand people who don't do their rehab. Like, it's hard, it's time consuming, it's boring, it's frustrating. You just want to be out there, say if it's team sport, your teammates are playing and you can't. So yeah, I definitely think it helps shape you as a rehab professional if you've been through injury. And it's actually really interesting to see athletes who've never had an injury before. Like, they don't know what to do after they've been injured. They don't know where to start. They've never been to a physio before, for example, whereas someone who's had a few injuries kind of, yeah. I also think it shapes you as an athlete. You learn resilience, you learn setbacks, all those kind of things. So it's
Absolutely,
I think it's good for your development as a person. I know it's a bit cliched, but it's true.
No, it is very true, and I think for myself, yeah, some of my biggest periods of growth was rehabbing from injuries, and I think, yeah, like you said, it's the biggest opportunity to improve yourself as an athlete, because an injury, I mean, obviously some of them are just sort of random contact injuries where you get, someone, flies into you and you tear your ACL or something like that, where it's just one of those things that you couldn't necessarily prevent. But often an injury is a sign that you weren't strong in that range of motion, or you were lacking some kind of characteristic, or strength or flexibility, or something that was limiting your performance as well. And so often injury rehab can be the best conduit for improving performance.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things I like to say to people, especially say younger athletes, like teenagers, early 20s, is by the time we're done with rehab, you'll be a better athlete than you were before. And you've got time to address things that maybe wouldn't have been focused on, or maybe because you're going through your strength and power testing, that sort of thing, you actually uncover things that might not have been picked up before. You can work on movement patterns. So yeah, I think it's a chance to reset and set up the rest of your athletic career, whether that's as a recreational athlete or wanting to be professional, that sort of thing. You get a chance to focus on things that you might otherwise not.
For sure.
So yeah, it can be a real growth thing, and like, it's quite philosophical, but I think we grow the most in the hardest times. And like, injuries, one of them. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, and mindset is such an important thing when well, for anything in life, but especially with those challenging situations and things like injuries, where the mindset you take towards the rehab or towards the injury literally makes all the difference to your outcome. Like, you could view the injury as like, oh no, I've like done my ACL, I'm ruined. I know all these people who haven't gone back after ACL or whatever, or XYZ. You can get down in the dumps about your injury, and then that will shape the trajectory you go down. And there are a heap of people who've, their careers have been ended by injuries, and then they end up doing something they don't like, and the sort of spiral kind of story. But there's also plenty of stories of people who've done the opposite and successfully rehabbed a really tough injury and gotten back and played better than ever. And if you sort of focus on more of the success stories, and I think working with someone you know and trust is huge as well, and getting guidance, it can be the best thing for you. So it's that mindset is really key.
Yeah, and I think it builds a team around you, right? So you have a physio, you might also be seeing a sports doctor, you're seeing, say, a myotherapist or a massage therapist, you've got a strength and conditioning coach, something like that, and you build a real support team, and then you can draw on those that support team when you need it in the future. And I think that builds your confidence in yourself as well. You know what? If something goes wrong, I know who I'm going to call.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that injury experience can be devastating, but but also I think it's you can grow out of it. So yeah, and I think that's really cool as a physio, and you would have seen this yourself when you're working as well. Like you're part of that journey, and people are really grateful for being there through like a really tough time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always interested with physios. Like you said, you've been in the industry, I suppose, or been practicing for 12 years. I'm always interested in how people's practice has evolved over that time, because obviously, I guess at uni you probably would have been taught, I mean, fairly similar things to what I was taught, but there's probably about I don't know, like a 6-7 year difference there. So maybe some differences in what you've been taught at uni, but like, were there any courses that really shaped your practice, or anything that you've sort of, like, any paths that you've gone down in the physio world? Because it's a very big world. Anything that sort of really stuck out to you as like major turning points or epiphanies or anything like that in terms of your physio practice?
Yeah, I think for me, I actually think we're on the cusp of a big shift in the physio game, and
sure.
really about on the technology that we can use. So, when I went through uni, it's like strength testing is you push against their leg extension while they're leg extending, and you get a manual muscle test, and it's 1 through to 5 out of 5, and that's your strength testing and that kind of thing. Whereas now, we can tell you exactly how much force you can push in that movement, and we've got equipment that just tells us so much information about forces, rate of force development, landing symmetries between one side and the other, ability to create propulsion, all this kind of stuff. And so I think the next, say, 10, maybe even 15 years, we're going to have a big shift in physio. So I think for me, that coming on board is like, I'm so excited about the next part. And I think for me, I actually don't know that we do rehab that well.
In general,
we like to think we do, but in general, it's not done that well. And I think we're going to see some physios and some clinics really leap ahead of that. And so, yeah, for me, I think that big shift has been that kind of technology coming on board. And yeah, just being able to offer a product in terms of a rehabilitation that's far superior to what we used to be able to offer. And like I think the elite world gets that stuff sooner, depending on which sport you're in and the finances and that kind of thing. But we're offering that at a general, anyone can come in and use that kind of technology now, which is really cool. So I think I don't think it's necessarily been a course that I did or one moment, but I just think like the last few years, that for me is really like, I'm such a physio nerd these days. Like I love it. My partner's always like, "Oh, you're just so in love with being a physio." I'm like, "Yeah, I am, because it's so cool. Like what we're doing is amazing, and there's lots of really cool research coming out." So yeah, I think the next part's going to be amazing.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. There is a major shift happening, getting much more specific with strength testing and different performance tests that we really didn't even touch at all in uni. I do remember going through the sort of grade 1 to 5 muscle test and manual muscle testing, and I mean, as a general sort of overlook, I think it can be helpful in some contexts, but yeah, when you're talking about sport, and especially sort of higher level elite sport, then getting a lot more detailed and nuanced on the test makes a lot of sense. And I think the general shift, I suppose, that I've seen in physio is a much bigger focus on active approaches, things like strength training, mobility training, things that empower the client to take more control of their own rehab, as opposed to relying on a physio or a chiro or whoever to sort of keep fixing them when things go wrong. And I'm interested if you, like, for myself, I started off in a very manual therapy sort of focused clinic, and over time with what I was reading and the movement and training that I was doing, I sort of started transitioning to a lot more of a movement based approach. Is that kind of been a similar journey for you? Have you gone, have you started with like mostly manual therapy and transitioned fully over? Sort of approach with that?
Yeah, I think the exercise side of physio doesn't get taught very well in undergrad courses.
Yeah, I did about 6
and
months, and that was still not very well taught.
yeah, like for us, the first month of first year was on massage,
Yeah.
and I understand that, like we were starting to learn anatomy then. Massage is probably something you can teach without lots of other background knowledge while you're also doing your anatomy and that kind of thing. But from a physio skills perspective, the first thing we look with massage, and maybe that's a little bit sort of ironic because physio is going to less manual therapy. I'm a big believer in manual therapy. I think there's a lot of benefits for manual therapy in the right way at the right time. And I think for me, the biggest thing is how you frame it. Like if I say to someone, me doing this is going to fix you, then that's what they think they're coming there for. Whereas, if I say to someone, I'm going to do this technique to get some extra ankle range of motion, then we're going to go and do some exercises that'll help, say, calf strength, because your calf's getting tired, therefore it's tightening up, and therefore you're ending up with an anterior impingement. They're thinking, okay, he's just helping me get some more range, but I've got to go and do this rehab myself. So it's really around how you frame it, how you educate, the conversations that you're having with the person that you're working with. But yeah, I'm lucky. I probably the last few clinics, at least, especially that I've worked at, it's a real exercise focus, lots of movement. I almost think that the rehab world has gone in some areas too far to only exercise, and I think there's a big role for manual therapy and hands-on techniques in the sports world. Like that our example we had earlier of the athlete for the grand final. If your grand final's tomorrow and you want to feel better, I'm reaching for the manual therapy, right? We haven't got 6 months to do a good exercise regime, or even 6 weeks. We've got 1 day. But I definitely think that empowerment, that you're part of the process, you need to go home and do this sort of work, come into the gym and do it with us. That sort of thing is absolutely the right approach. And I think if you get the right balance between those two, then you end up with the best treatment you can get.
Yeah, I think, and that's pretty much where I ended up as well, because when I first started practicing, then I learnt, because the clinic I was at was very manual therapy based. I don't know if you've heard of Ridgway method.
I've met Michael Ridgway. He came down and
have you?
spoke to a clinic that I worked at. The boss
there you go.
kind of interested in his approach. So I haven't. I haven't touched it for a few years, but maybe like 5 years ago, I learned a bit about it.
Yeah, so I worked for him at Baruna, what was then Baruna Physio, and it's a big oversimplification to just say it's a manual therapy based approach, but we did practice primarily with manual therapy.
Very much.
And I could delve into the whole concept around Ridgway method, but the point is that we could get some amazing results in sessions with manual therapy. Like it is pretty crazy what a good manual treatment can do in terms of increasing range of motion and modifying symptoms. And that can be very powerful for some people. And I guess my issue was that I didn't feel like I was providing people with enough. Like I kind of knew, they should probably do these exercises, but the bulk of the session was on manual therapy and the exercises were sort of like more of the afterthought. Mm-hmm. Whereas the approach that you just talked about, which pretty much was what I ended up coming to, was that we're going to spend a little bit of time on manual therapy if it's relevant, if it's sort of indicated, I suppose. And then we're going to like immediately follow that up with the exercise or whatever the movement or the functional task that is relevant, and we're going to go through that and that is sort of the bulk of the session. And obviously that's going to depend on the individual and the context as well. But when you prioritize it in the session and go, this is what we're really after, we're using the manual therapy to facilitate this, but this is the thing that we're after, and this is the thing that you need to be doing, then I think that can make all the difference. Because I would find that even if I was like, oh, it's really important to do your exercises, if people got the message in the session that the manual therapy was the thing that was doing the fixing, then that's kind of what they would end up relying on versus sort of really experiencing the functional difference in the session. And that's not to say that I'm not trying to paint Ridgway method in a poor light. It's probably just the way I was practicing Ridgway method at the time with my own skills and everything. But I did find with that more of a hybrid approach, I could sort of see people for less sessions. They would end up generally with a better outcome, and it would be longer lasting. So it is an important thing, I think, to discuss though, in terms of when we talk about the shift in physio, because there is such a, I think you're right. Like the pendulum swinging in the other direction, and possibly has swung a little too far in terms of not everyone, but a lot of people. There's some big voices out there like Adam Meekins and stuff. Who was saying you should never use manual therapy. And things like this that I think can confuse things. But I do believe that there is a role for it in the right context, and like you said, with the right narrative and sort of education around it.
Yeah, I think there's two reasons to use manual therapy. And the first one's symptom modification.
Yeah.
So this person's got some symptoms, let's reduce their symptoms. And I would basket that in the same place as foam rolling, a bunch of other treatment modalities that they've got their time and their place. Like I'm a big believer in symptom modifiers. If someone needs and I think especially early on in a rehab, I want like a wow moment. I want someone to be like, oh wow, I feel so much better, because in that moment they buy in. They go, okay, Nick knows how to help me. I'm feeling better than I was half an hour ago, 10 minutes ago, whatever it is. And then, okay, Nick's asked me to do this rehab plan. I'm going to follow it.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because the person or the athlete needs to buy into what you're getting them to do.
100%. Yeah.
And so
otherwise they'll go somewhere else.
Yeah. Like they need to trust the process, because that way, they're going to get at the outcome that they want and you want them to get. The second reason for manual therapy for me is to progress treatment along. So like if we use our example of anterior impingement of the ankle, we can get there just through exercise. But I think I can usually get there faster doing some manual therapy and then exercise.
Yeah.
So it's like I think they're two different camps, right? One of them is a symptom modifier, which is just let's feel better. And then the other one's let's progress along our rehab path. So I like, it's not very often, but every now and then I'll see someone 2-3 times a week, because to get along, like we're getting those jumps along with rehab because of manual therapy in that situation. Whereas the symptom modifier, like I think we can get that in other ways at home where they don't need to be coming in to see me.
Yeah.
So, and then I guess maybe a third one, it's probably similar to symptom modification, but recovery. So manual therapy like massage is a recovery modality and tool. So if we're playing a tournament, we're playing 8 games in 2 weeks. It's really not about anything other than just recovering between the games. And so manual therapy is a really helpful tool in that situation. But I think the pendulum for some people maybe swung too far, but it'll swing back, right? Everything regresses to the mean.
True.
So, we've gone from physios just being manual therapists to exercises coming more and more. And that's part of that big shift that we were talking about in physio. Like I think some people at physios are almost calling themselves more rehab professionals or sports rehabilitation therapists, that kind of thing. And I think that's probably getting the right balance there.
For sure. And you mentioned obviously that you treat a lot of hockey players, and you're the physio for Victorian men's team, and there's a lot of running involved, and you've got a number of great posts on running on your Instagram as well. And I just thought it'd be interesting to chat about like sort of how you're thinking about running in terms of like all of the sort of buzzwords, I suppose, around biomechanics and cadence and heel strike versus forefoot strike, and all of that.
Yeah, let's open up the can of
Let's do it.
So yeah, from a running technique perspective, I'm a big believer that we can modify technique and improve running technique. And while there's definitely not every runner should look like this. So there's certain methods of running technique out there that are, you really look for these certain characteristics. You can modify and improve running. And I think, unfortunately, this is not done very well in general. And a lot of the running technique that's done focuses on outcomes. So if we think of running, it is a movement pattern, just the same way as squat, a deadlift, throwing is a movement pattern, running is a movement pattern. And you can change that movement pattern. Now, the last parts of the movement pattern are what happens at the ground. Mm-hmm. So with your feet. And a lot of the running technique that's done focuses on what's happening in the lower leg and the foot. So shortening the step, increasing the cadence, where you land on your foot. That's the last parts of the running technique. And they're really an outcome. So rather than modifying the outcome, we should modify the beginning of the running technique and then flow down towards what's happening at the ground. So like the example I like to use is a tennis stroke. Are we just going to start by modifying what's happening at the hand? No, we're going to modify what's happening at the body. And that, like, tennis really comes from the legs through to the hips, the trunk, shoulder, hand. So the outcome is the tennis stroke, but actually the movement pattern is coming from further in the body. So cadence for me, for example, you mentioned, I think cadence is completely irrelevant. We know for every inch of height extra that your cadence drops by 3. When you run faster, your cadence goes higher. When you run slower, it goes lower. As you get fatigued, it tends to drop a little bit. It changes from what surface you're running on. It changes from incline, decline, flat. So cadence is so variable within the one runner that I just don't think we can find like a way to use cadence and say you should run at this cadence, because it's going to change consistently throughout a run. Cadence is absolutely an outcome. It's a score that comes as a product of the movement pattern of running. And cadence, even in a lot of research, cadence gets used to modify running technique. Whereas I'm a big believer, let's modify the movement pattern, and then the cadence just takes care of itself. You'll just run at the cadence that you run at when you're running at that speed. You'll even change your cadence if you change your shoes in some situations. So I think cadence is kind of actually irrelevant. I don't track it. I don't, like, if I've got someone that we're doing running technique, I don't look at their cadence at all. But heaps of the research is, around increasing cadence.
Wonder why is that, do you think?
I think because it's something that you can do easily. You can, like, my watch tells me what my cadence is. I can go, I'm running at a cadence of 165. Okay, I can modify that easily. Whereas actually cueing a movement change is probably more difficult and much more individualized rather than that. And like, I think with cadence, if you run at a higher cadence, you've got less time to overstride, which is where the foot lands out in front of the body. You don't have the time to do that because you're running at a higher cadence. So you might reduce someone's pain by doing that because they're not overstriding, so they're not overloading structures with the ground reaction forces. But actually, we're not improving the movement pattern. We're just changing what's happening really at the lower leg.
Yeah.
With
And sorry, go on.
Yeah, you asked about strike patterns.
Mm.
This is an interesting one. So there's a lot of research that shows heel striking, mid to forefoot striking, no change in injury rates, no change in sort of performance outcomes from running. Typically, faster runners run on the mid to forefoot. But once again, this is an outcome. It's the very, very last thing that happens, right? Where we land on the ground. So typically, I think probably someone who is running in a really good running technique will run further forward, mid to forefoot, particularly if they're really fast. If someone comes to me and they're heel striking, I'm not going to change that. I actually think that's really mediocre running technique advice to change what's happening at their foot there.
Based on the same light of it being more of an outcome of the overall movement pattern.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So let's change what's happening further up the chain. And then it kind of takes care of itself.
And what are some of those things that you would tend to focus on up the chain?
Yeah. I think for me, the trunk is the platform of running. And I know this is probably a little bit confusing because clearly the ground is the thing that we run on. But for me, running is the legs driving down into the ground and we're pushing ourselves off the ground to create that propulsion. So the legs have to push off something to drive down into the ground, and that's the trunk. So looking at trunk position, looking at what's happening with the arms, really getting that kind of upper back, lower back, pelvis. But really looking at the trunk. For me, that's the beginning. That's the platform.
Yeah, and that that sort of lines up well from like a developmental point of view. Like when we're all developing, we get trunk control and head control first, and then we build out from there. And I think you can often take a very similar approach to rehab and get pretty good results with first taking care of the trunk and then building out sort of. There's a I guess a quote. I don't actually know who said it, but a phrase like proximal stability for distal mobility. So you get better outcomes distally, as in further down or further away from the trunk, when you get good stability at the trunk. And obviously a lot of that has to do with breath control as well, and diaphragm function and core control, and then glute function and so on. And so I guess I'm interested. I mean, this is a conversation that sort of comes up a fair bit because you just mentioned in terms of like heel striking versus midfoot striking. In the research, there's not really a clear picture about how that relates to injury risk and so on. And we know that obviously there's so many different variables that come into injury risk and people's experience of pain, like load management and other psychosocial factors. But I always like to use the example of, say, someone who's never worn shoes, or like I feel like the only time someone would really heel strike, especially if they were running on flat ground, is if they did have a cushion between their heel and the ground, because it just doesn't feel as good to heel strike when you don't have a cushion there. Yeah. And what are your thoughts about that in terms of like a cushioned heel on a shoe allowing a heel strike versus like, do you find if you get someone to try running barefoot that immediately changes their technique? And what's your approach with that?
Yeah, so I knew this was going to come up, and I'm probably a little bit different from some of your other guests and some of like
that's good.
The barefoot community.
I like hearing some different perspectives.
Yeah, so I think for me, what's happening at the foot health, foot function, that kind of thing, it's you've got to take what's your biggest priority in that moment and that situation. So I agree. I think heeled cushion shoes have in a lot of ways caused heel striking. But I think they're not the only reason that it's come about. I think for me, like I don't play hockey in a minimalist shoe.
Yeah.
I play in a hockey shoe. It's got a bit of a heel. It's tape it at the toe box. Like I can feel it because I'm normally in minimalist shoes or barefoot, and I can feel it there. But it's also the shoe that I play hockey the best in.
Yeah.
If I went to play hockey in some Vivo barefoots, I'd fall over first time I went to change direction.
Yeah, so, that actually happened to me. I played futsal in a pair of Vivos just for like a casual game, and I was like, oh, okay, there is a function for certain sport specific shoes.
Exactly, right. And so for me, that's a performance realm.
Yeah.
And I think of running as a performance realm too. So so for me, if someone comes in and they run the best in a high stack shoe with a lot of cushion, you know, whether or not it's a super shoe with carbon plates or something like that, whatever they run the best in, and that will probably mean that their running technique is the best because your shoe will change your running technique, then I think that's great because it's a performance realm. We're there to run the best that we can. So how many hours a week does that person run? Probably not many more than 10 hours a week. You have to be really, really elite to be running more than 10 hours a week. And if you think how much of your time are you on your feet, I'd far rather change someone's shoe for their everyday work, study, casual shoe rather than the running shoe to go to a more minimalist shoe.
Yeah,
so
can agree
for
there.
me, getting the shoe that they spend the most amount of time in, that's what I'll address first.
Yeah.
Now I run better in a lower drop shoe, like an 8-10 mil shoe. My technique isn't as good as I run a 0 to, you know, something like that. So for me, lower drop's actually good, but I'm not running to win gold medals. I run to stay fit, to enjoy running, to prepare for hockey, and just because I enjoy it. So for me, like a super shoe isn't going to make much sense. Those really high stack shoes. Whereas so I think that's the toss up for me with running shoes is let's find the shoe that you run the best in. But then the rest of the time, let's make sure we look after your feet. And I think it's really interesting. You know, the Olympics have been on fairly recently, and a lot of the track athletes finish their race, even a shortish race, and they take their spikes straight off.
Yeah.
What I think would be really interesting to know, and this will come, is if we get those shoes with, say, a wider toe box. Now, they're still going to have a heel to toe drop. They're still going to have a fair bit of stack to them, especially like the long distance, sort of the Alpha Flies and Vaporfly Nikes and those kind of super shoes. But it would be interesting to see what would happen if you go a wider toe box. Now you've got more shoe there, like it's a heavier shoe inherently because it's wider. But maybe the big toe function's a bit better and you get better propulsion. Maybe not. So, and that might be different for different runners. But like I know there's soccer boots being designed now that have got a wide toe box.
I'm going to get in touch with them because I'm about to start playing a sort of casual game, and I bought some sort of relatively cheap sort of typical soccer shoes, I suppose, and they're feeling pretty squishy on the feet, especially for me. I'm 95% of the time barefoot or in barefoot shoes, so you really feel the difference when you've transitioned.
So I think it's that trade-off, right? So for someone whose performance isn't their main realm, or maybe even someone who is, maybe they do some of their running in a more minimalist shoe, if they can handle the capacity and the loads of it, and then they're say faster track sessions and their races they run in a racing shoe, that kind of thing. So for me, I think like to sort of answer your question, I think the heel strike part of that has definitely been cushioned heeled shoes. But then when it comes to actually selecting shoes for runners and working with them, it's what shoe they run best in. For me.
And do you think on that sort of what shoe they run best in, like I definitely see where you're coming from in terms of like a lot of runners don't necessarily want to give up their running volume if they don't have to. And so if it's if you tell someone, oh, you have to switch to this shoe because it's, quote unquote better for you or more natural or whatever, but that means you're going to have to really dial back your volume. You're going to have to sort of change up your technique and, really work a whole heap on calf strength and, different factors that will come of this change in footwear. It's not really feasible for a lot of runners to do. And if you could solve their issue with a more simple change and they keep running and they're injury free, then it's, much of a muchness kind of.
Yeah.
But do you think, I don't know where you're at in terms of like from a biomechanical perspective, like could they run even better if they did take the time to learn how to load through their midfoot or forefoot and, were happy to dial back their volume and change their footwear? Do you think that would be optimal, or do you think it's sort of, again, it kind of doesn't matter, like whether the foot does the shock absorption or the cushion of the shoe?
So I actually think, why not both?
Yeah.
Like, my genuine answer is, why not both?
Yeah.
So if we can get X amount of energy storage and release through the foot, the Achilles, and we can also get it from the shoe.
Yeah.
Hey, that's even better. But it's so individual. I think it's sort of, it probably comes down to ideology.
Yeah.
So there are certain practitioners out there that think running in minimalist shoes, that's natural running. That's how we should run. That's how we were designed to run, so on and so forth. And I think there's an argument for that. I'm not disagreeing with that. Like, I don't know how many people had a go at it, but no one's winning gold medals in minimalist shoes.
Yeah.
They're winning with super shoes. So I don't know how much that's been tested, but I think let's up the function of the foot. Like, I put a poll up on my Instagram recently saying, like, do you think strengthening your foot will improve performance in sport and running? And I think 95% of people answered. I had a lot of responses, and 95% of people said yes.
Yeah.
I agree. I think it should. We've got to prove it. But so doing that, and like, I'm sure I have fair few people who are barefooters that follow me. So maybe it's a skewed, samples. But I think let's get that. But maybe for that performance realm, the shoe also is helpful, because we know you get benefit from the foam
from performance
in certain shoes. We know, like, you get a little bit from that carbon plate. So when it comes to a real performance realm, and I think it's up to the individual to decide where that performance sits. I'm not a performance runner myself.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not running to, like, I don't race much. I'm not trying to break records or anything like that. So it's more for enjoyment. So for someone like me, maybe it's less about that shoe and bring the foot function up and that kind of thing.
But, and the I guess the other thing that gets discussed is, like, if you have a cushion, say you jump and land on a cushioned surface, you're going to land differently to if it's a hard surface. So if you're jumping and landing on a cushion, you probably be all right to land on your heels because it's just a cushioned surface. If it's a bit of concrete or something, it's not going to feel as good to land on your heels. And I guess it's the question of whether the cushioning, by allowing a heel strike, does that, because if you weren't cushioned, then you wouldn't heel strike and you'd be absorbing the loads differently through your feet and Achilles and so on. The question is whether the cushion promotes you using a certain pattern that actually isn't optimal for the body in the long term. You might not see a change in performance or injury in the short term, but over time, does it build up? And I mean, to be honest, I'm not fully decided on it. That kind of makes sense to me that it could be true. But obviously the research isn't completely sold on it. But yeah, what do you think, or have you explored that much?
Yeah, I think if you run with a really good movement pattern, you'll end up running mid to fore.
Yeah.
But the change isn't change your strike to mid to fore. It's change the movement pattern and you'll end up running there.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Some of the those high-end super shoes are actually designed to land there. They're designed to land on your mid to fore. So the runners with the best running technique will get more out of that shoe than someone who's landing further back on the foot. I think the other thing is heel striking, depending on where it lands, but in some ways it's a braking force. And especially heel striking with an overstride is a braking force. So then we're inefficient because when we land, we brake and then we create propulsion again. So once again, to be very clear, let's not get anyone who listens to this and then decides, heel striking is bad, let's change it to a 4 foot strike. Change the movement pattern and you'll get the outcome that you want. But that heel strike, for multiple reasons, like go and jump up and down 10 times in bare feet on your heels. It doesn't feel very nice on a hard surface. It doesn't feel nice. You can feel the shocks through your body and your knees, your hips, your back. So we're not really designed for that. And for sure, cushion shoes do let people get away with that. But I still believe, and I've sort of tossed and turned over the last few years with this, I still believe that there's a role for cushion shoes in that performance realm.
That's good. And I really love exploring these topics, especially if there is, I don't think we actually think differently about it, but it's sort of getting different perspectives and hearing things sort of spoken about differently, I think is really important. And what you said, which I think is a really great takeaway for people, is don't focus so much on the strike because that's the outcome. Just focus on the movement pattern in general, and generally the outcome will happen. And it's sort of, I think that's a really key point, and that can be applied to anything besides running as well. Is just focus on the pattern in general, and the outcome will follow.
Yeah. It's like another example, golf. Golf. The rotation comes all the way through the body, so we wouldn't just start with changing what you're doing at your hands and then the club face. We'd change the movement through the whole body. Any movement pattern. So it's I think it's and hopefully over the next however many years we see that shift in running. I try not to be too dogmatic, but I think it's really important that we get away from this changing outcomes to changing what's happening through the body.
And if there's another good takeaway from that whole topic and this conversation, is just the extreme importance of context and nuance and individualization, and not sort of painting everything with like, everyone must do this immediately, or everyone must do that. It's sort of, it really does depend on people's goals around whether it's performance or injury prevention or recreation or whatever, and it depends on their context and their history and so many different factors, and it's sort of, you can have principles and heuristics that you follow, but in terms of having a one size fits all, it doesn't really make sense. And also just the fact that the shoe you do sport in is probably not as important as the shoe you wear all the time, and the sort of the environment of your foot and your body that you spend the most time in is the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. And we take that with other realms of sport, right? So like you wear a particular set of clothing for the sport that you're going to do, right? Like a triathlon suit is really, really good for triathlon, but it's not great for hanging out with your friends. That sounds silly, but it's true. And I'd really take that approach with shoes and feet as well. So I almost want my athletes to do the best thing they can with their feet when they're not in their performance realm. And then when they're in their performance realm, it's just about performance.
It sounds like a good approach. And the other thing that you talk a fair bit about on your Instagram, and I love that you get all these topics out, and your graphics are really cool, by the way you sort of do all your Instagram graphics and everything. But just the concept of load management and how that relates to injury, because I think that's something that doesn't get well, it's probably getting talked about a lot more lately, but I guess in general, traditional physiotherapy, I suppose, doesn't really address load management that much.
Yeah, so I think load, the word load can be used in a few contexts. In load management, we talk about the training loads, the amount of, I guess, forces and stress on the body from training. In the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of data that's come out about load management strategies and essentially doing too much too fast causes an issue, and that's one of the big factors in injury. Capacity, how much we can do. We don't want our load to exceed how much we can do. So it's funny, we were talking about manual therapy earlier, and we know what manual therapy kind of can do, but one of the things it can't do is change capacity.
Yeah.
So you don't get stronger, you don't get better endurance, you don't move with a better movement pattern necessarily from manual therapy. So it'll help, but it doesn't change that load versus capacity equation. So load management is working out how much am I doing, how much can I do? Is there a discrepancy there in an okay way and there I can do a bit more, or is it, am I overloading? And I think that's where we see a lot of our injuries coming from. And this is, like you said before, not that contact injury, that one moment, but more the sort of things that develop over time, gradual onset type pains, and it's often a load versus capacity discrepancy.
Yeah.
Load management is so complex.
Yeah.
Like I was lucky enough to do a course at the Australian Institute of Sport last year, and there was a 2-hour lecture on injury prevention and another 2-hour lecture on load management, which I can guarantee you were really fascinating but super dry. And at the end of that, like 4 hours, Mick Drew, who was presenting it, was kind of like, it depends. There's no perfect, like,
Yeah.
He's like, I don't know what I would track, maybe just time doing exercise. But I spend a lot of time with athletes working out, sort of how much you've been doing, what type of exercise that is. Like one of the National League hockey guys last week had sore calves, and we're in lockdown in Melbourne, and he's not, so they're not playing games on the weekend in their regular club season. And so he's been going for runs on the weekend instead. And for him, his thinking was, oh, well, I would normally play in game, I'm going for a run. But in a game, you sprint, you walk, you jog, you walk, you jog, you walk, you sprint. Whereas continuous running of 6-8 Ks is very, very different load on the body. And for him, that's less time. He's probably running, a similar-ish distance, but the type of running is very different. So this is where load management gets so complex, and there's definitely no perfect, but it's a really, really important thing.
Yeah, and it is really important, and I think at a more basic level for people to understand that injuries sort of, for the most part, they don't just pop up out of nowhere for no reason. And a lot of times people do think that. They're like, oh yeah, it just happened. Like I went for a run one time and this just occurred. And then usually with some questioning, you'll figure out that they actually did a lot more than they usually do. And then once they realize that, it does sort of, I find it does sort of help them bring some power back of like, oh, I can see how I actually did that. I thought I could just run for 10Ks when I hadn't run for 5 years or something like that. I thought I could just go out for a run. But they didn't realize that that's not how the body works. Like it needs to adapt to loads over time. And even just at that most basic level, I think can be a really key thing for people understanding like the approach you're taking to rehab and like why you're doing certain things is to increase the load tolerance of that body part, or often to increase the variability, because I think that is another thing that often is missed is, we can, most people these days are sort of specialists. Like they're either a hockey player or they're a runner or they're a gymnast or they're a tennis player or something. And for the rest of their time, they're unfortunately, most people tend to be sedentary and they don't really get much movement variability in their day, and then therefore their body gets good at sort of being sit down and still, and then they go and play something high load over and over again, and then they end up with an issue. But I think a lot of people are missing that nutrient of variability, like actually switching up the movements that they're doing frequently and learning different skills. And I think the body thrives under that kind of variability, but it's something that most people are missing.
Yeah, I think the body's ability to adapt is incredible.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
And yeah, I think we've just got to give it that time to adapt. So there's some really interesting MRI scans of like 70-year-old triathlete and a 50-year-old triathlete, and the amount of like their bones.
Oh, I've seen that one. Yeah,
great, and their quality of muscle looks really good, and that kind of thing, because their body's really well adapted to running and riding. Essentially, that's and swimming as well, but the loads in swimming are very minimal. But if you do more than the body can adapt to, that's when you end up with an issue. And I think your example's a really good one. I had a guy a few weeks ago he was a runner last year in lockdown. Then he's normally a gym goer, so he wasn't running for the first half of this year at all. And then we went into a lockdown, and so he started running again. And he was running the same volume that he was running a year ago, 30 Ks a week. So he went from not running at all to running 30 Ks a week. And after 3.5 weeks, he got sore.
Yeah.
And in his mind, he's like, well, I'm exercising the same amount of time or even less than I normally would in the gym. And it's exactly the same exercise that I was doing a year ago. How come I'm injured? And so we had that conversation. I drew him a graph. I said 0, 0, 0, 30, 30, 30, 30. And said, like, on those loads on your body, it's just too much too soon. And so he's got a better understanding of that now. And like I said, I think, like you said, that empowers him. Next time he wants to start running again, if he goes back to only going to the gym and not running, which may happen when gyms are open again, if he's going to start up running again in the future, he'll do it more gradually. Yeah, I think the example I like to give to people is there's a guy that ran 50 marathons in 50 days in 50 different states of America.
Yeah, that's insane.
That's unbelievable. I'm not advocating anyone to do that, but like the load tolerance that you can get to is phenomenal.
Yeah.
If you give the body the ability and the time to do what it can do. So it's just that too much too soon, really.
Yeah.
Then we can go to things like technique. So you can increase your running quicker if you've got a good technique, because your body can handle those forces, strength, endurance, all those kind of things. How well you're recovering between your runs. There's lots and lots of things in it, but that ability to adapt is amazing. So like people can trust their body to be able to adapt if they give it the conditions to do so.
100%. Yeah.
Sleeping 4 hours a night, not eating well, not getting enough water, psychologically stressed, it's going to be harder.
Yeah.
So yeah, all those things fall into, I guess, that kind of load management conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, because you could be giving your body the same, like even if that runner had built up gradually to 30 Ks, or even if he'd started with 10 Ks or whatever, something that maybe physically his body was strong enough to do. If he was, like you said, if he was very underslept and overstressed and, things are going on outside of that, he still might get injured, or he still might experience pain as a result of that load, even if it wasn't something sort of specifically strength wise or endurance wise or something like that that was the issue.
Yeah, I mean, those things drop your capacity.
Yeah.
So it changes
exactly,
the load to capacity equation.
Yeah.
But not in the pure running sense of the load. It just changes your capacity.
Yeah. And recovery, that we'll have to wrap up soon, but the recovery aspect, I think, is really interesting, and that has been getting a lot of attention lately. And I think you did I think it was you who did a big post on it somewhat recently, maybe a couple of months ago. But what's your sort of key things when it comes to recovery that you focus on with your athletes?
Yeah. So I think I did probably a series, and I went through the key ones. If you think of the food pyramid, the bottom of the pyramid is the more important foods, and there's conjecture around that one anyway, but we'll just use that example. The bottom for recovery is sleep and relaxation. So relaxation being hanging out, reading a book, chatting with your friends, watching a movie, whatever you like to do to relax, and then getting sleep. So that kind of 8 hours a night is the optimal minimum for sleep, and good quality sleep. The next thing is nutrition and hydration. So that's pre-exercise nutrition will affect your recovery afterwards, but then also making sure you're replenishing afterwards. And that, like, think of that, those two is almost like charging your battery.
Yeah.
Enough sleep and enough fuel. The next three things on the pyramid, and these have relatively similar evidence, are active recovery, so movement, water immersion, and compression. And you can put massage probably in that active recovery combo. So water immersion being plunge pools, if you haven't got that, in the bath, shower, so on and so forth. Compression, the most basic level compressions like tights, or compression garments, and then you can go through to the pump boots, and then water immersion gets you compression as well. So for me, the biggest thing about recovery, then the top of the pyramid's kind of cryotherapy chambers, infrared saunas. There's not a lot of evidence to support those. But I think the biggest thing for recovery is those bottom two are the foundations. So you're not going to get as much out of wearing compression if you're sleeping poorly.
Yeah.
If you're not eating well, those kind of things. So if you're going to focus on anything, it's focus on the bottom two. And the example that I've heard used before and I like to use is, I think it's LeBron James, really loves his cryotherapy chamber. That's great because he's probably sleeping 8 hours.
Yeah.
He's eating really well. He's doing all the things below it. So the 1% or the 0.5% or whatever he gets out of that cryotherapy chamber actually makes a difference because he's doing everything else well.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're sleeping 6 hours a night, not eating well, not well hydrated, that 0.5% is like, it's not going to show up. Yeah. And this stuff's hard. Sleeping 8 hours a night, like, you've got to work to do that.
Yeah. It takes preparation and planning, and
like having good sleep health. For some people, they sleep really well, and it's not an issue. But for most people, it requires effort. But you'll see those benefits. I've heard stories of like Olympic level athletes that have gone from 8th, 10th in the world to the next Olympic cycle, winning a gold medal, and the biggest change they made was getting extra sleep.
And obviously they've developed an athlete and it's more years of training. There's other variables there, but that getting a better sleep is actually really, really important, because the better recovered you are, the more you can train. The better your capacity.
Perform in your training sessions and therefore get more benefit. So
the sleep, and that is getting a lot of I guess airplay lately, which is great in terms of like the books from Matthew Walker and Sean Stevenson and things like that are really sort of helping people see that. And I know a lot of the elite, it's something that a lot of elite athletes and sports teams and everything are looking at now, is really how to dial in that sleep health. And it seems to be a massive key for performance and for injury prevention. So if you can take something away from this, make sure you're hitting the bottom of the recovery pyramid, we're going to call it. Not necessarily the food pyramid, but the recovery pyramid is definitely something to be hitting those two at the bottom. If you can spend $50 on some really good food, like really good whole food, nutritious, nutrient dense food, probably spend that over your cryotherapy chamber.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're going to put your money onto one of them, you'd pick the food.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Or maybe get a really good nap or something if it's a time thing. But yeah, do focus on those sort of key things and build out from there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that might be a good place to wrap up. I think there are actually a number of other things I'd love to dig into with you around sort of tendinopathies and a bit more into feet and stuff. But I think it would be cool to do another one in person once we can finally line up a podcast and we can do a round 2 and explore a bit more in depth around those kind of topics.
Yeah, I'd love to. Sounds great.
That'd be great.
Definitely.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks again for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for having me, and I hope everyone got a little bit out of it.
Yeah, actually, we'll put some stuff in the show notes, but for people to connect with you, like if they're in Melbourne and want to come and see you or they want to check out your stuff, what's the best place?
Yeah, so I work at Melbourne CBD Physio. That's the name of the clinic. I've got a website, so it's nickreesphysio.com.au.
Sweet.
And then my Instagram's Nick Rees Sports Physio. So if anyone wants to follow what my content, my posting, then they can do that as well. But yeah, you can get in touch with me through the website or book online at the clinic.
Awesome. All right, man. Sweet. Well, we'll chuck those in the show notes as well, so it's easy for people. And then we'll organize a catch up next time I'm down or you're up.
Sounds good. Thanks, James.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. Have a good one.